I'm going to wait a couple seconds here and make sure the stream is kind of all working and everything like that. But what I was planning to do this morning is yesterday, as most of you probably remember, if you were watching Laracon online live, I was building out this this kind of design that Steve put together for his talk in Tailwind to kind of give you a sort of run through of what my workflow is like with Tailwind and how you can sort of build custom user interfaces using it. Now, it's a fairly complex UI, even sort of trimmed down to what we have here. And because of that, even though we went for about an hour yesterday, we only got to about this far, which is pretty close, but it's missing a few pretty interesting elements. One is the responsive nav bar, so we don't have that implemented. Another is the custom radio buttons. So you can see here, Steve has kind of fancy custom ones. Here we're just using like kind of boring browser default ones. And I think the same thing for the checkboxes. He doesn't have like a checked state, but these are big, so you can kind of imagine these are going to be sort of custom. And then also the icons in the form fields and the button. There's also a little bit of nastiness that happens in this version. As you kind of shrink the UI down, you can kind of see like things start to butt up against each other in the bottom here and wrap in awkward ways. So what I was hoping to do this morning is spend probably about 45 minutes polishing this off and really kind of getting it up to that final level of polish and showing you how I personally would do some of this really funky stuff with Tailwind, like the custom inputs and stuff like that. Okay, so why don't we start with the custom radio buttons, because I think that's the thing that people were the most interested in based on the feedback in the chat. So if you look here, you can see that Steve has got these kind of big circles with this kind of big fat border, right? So how would we go about implementing that? So I'm going to start by implementing that directly in HTML, even though that means that the radio buttons aren't going to properly work. We're going to have to extract it to CSS eventually to make things behave properly. But just to get the design right, I think we can just mock that up in the HTML to start. So first things first, let's just pull up the Figma file and grab some sizes and colors and stuff. So if you look at these circles, they're 30 by 30. I don't know that we have a 30 size in Tailwind. I guess that would be like a 1.875 rem, which is like a 7.5 or something, which we don't have, but we can get pretty close. So this is what I'm going to do to start. I'm going to head up to this markup here where we have these checkbox or these radio buttons, and I'm going to start by just hiding the actual inputs. Now we can't actually make them display none or anything like that because that will prevent them from actually working. So we just kind of have to visually hide them. So to start, I'm just going to say class opacity 0 to sort of make them invisible. So now they go away, but clicking these is actually still selecting the right one. You just can't see it. It's not actually removing the space that they're taking up though. So we can do that by making them absolutely positioned relative to some container. So here's what I'm going to do for each one of these labels. And you know what? Let's just start with just doing it on this first one. I'll start by making this label position relative. And that basically makes it work as sort of a position reference or anchor for any absolute position things inside of it. So you can see if I set this input to be position absolute, and I get rid of the opacity, it removes it from the document flow, but it stays exactly where it is, which means this text bumps over underneath it. If I get rid of this relative, I think it should stay where it is to start. But if I was to do something like add some positioning to it, like in Tailwind, you can say pin T, which is the equivalent of top 0. You'll see this jumps way to the top of the browser now. And that's because the viewport is the nearest positioned element, so something that doesn't have position static. So if we want to position this relative to this label, we add position relative to the label, and that makes it act sort of like an anchor. So now this is going to be positioned relative to the label. We don't actually have to do anything like this. because we don't really care about where it's positioned. But still useful to mark this as sort of a position reference so that this doesn't jump somewhere weird on the screen if you do something odd. So we kind of got that positioned absolutely now, which removes it from the document flow, which gives us some more control over how we want to style everything inside. So I'm going to give this opacity 0 so it's invisible. And then to build the custom radio, we're going to use a new element. So the real input is going to be sort of hidden, and clicking the label is still going to select the input because of the fact that we have the label wrapping it. But we're going to use a different element as sort of the indicator. So I'm going to create just an empty span here, and we'll give it like an area hidden attribute because it's completely presentational and we don't want screen readers to even know that it's there. And we can start trying to style this. So I think the first thing that I'm going to do, because spans are inline elements and that makes them hard to size and stuff properly, if we make this label a flex container, then we have really good control over both of these elements because they behave like flex children, which is more like a block level element. So why don't we start by saying flex, and we'll do item center because we're going to want the text and the indicator to be centered with each other. And then for this element, why don't we start by giving it like a height of 5 and a width of 5, and let's just grab the colors from Figma. So it looks like it's got a background of gray 100, and the border is probably the same border as the inputs, which is gray 200. So we can say BG gray 1 and border gray 2, and this should kind of get us like something that we can kind of see. Okay, so now we've got like a square. It's a little bit small, so why don't we jump up to 6 instead of 5? And we don't want it to be square, so I'm going to add rounded full to say that I want the corners to be fully rounded, so it's circular. Okay, so it's still a little bit small, honestly, so why don't we jump up to 8? There's no 7 in Tailwind by default, but if we really needed it, we could add it. And 8 is not far off, actually. It's a little beefy, but it's not too bad. Maybe just for demonstration, we will give it a size of 7, and I'll show you kind of how you would do that. Head over to the Tailwind config file. Underneath theme, if we just want to add a new spacing value but don't want to override all of them, we can use this extend key. Then inside extend, we can say we want to extend the spacing scale with a value of 7, and we want 7 to be equal to 7 times 0.25 rem, right? So 1.75 rem, because that's kind of the missing value using sort of the relative Tailwind unit stuff that we talked about yesterday. So now we've added 7 as a value. So again, that's not a default value in Tailwind. You won't find that in the documentation, but we've added it to our build so we can reference it. So now here we can do something like H7, W7, and this should probably get us pretty close to what Steve had. I think it's still a tiny bit smaller than what Steve had, but I think it looks pretty good. Okay, so he's got a little bit more space between the text and the indicator. So instead of doing ML2 here, why don't we try an ML3 and maybe even an ML4. Let's see, how does that look? I think that looks pretty good. So that's good for like an unselected one. So why don't we apply these same styles to the next one, but we'll style the next one as selected, or maybe we'll just change the first one to be selected. So I'm going to start by adding these same classes to this label, and we'll do the same thing for this input. And we'll grab this indicator and pull it down and update this to ML4. So we should see now 2 indicators. Yeah. So let's style this one sort of using the selected state, and we'll leave this one as the unselected state as a sort of a backup. So taking a look here, you can see Steve has basically a really thick border on this. I'm using blue 700. So why don't we try using the borders built into Tailwind to sort of see what we get. So one thing I'm curious about, yeah, this border is like overlapping the gray border around it. So we don't have to worry about supporting the gray border and the blue border. We only need to have the blue border. And what was that color again? 700. Okay. So instead of border gray 2, why don't we try border blue 7? So now we get the blue border, but it's obviously too thin, right? So by default, Tailwind has a 2 pixel border, a 1 pixel border, and I think a 4 pixel border, and I think those are the only ones built in by default. We can double check this, of course, by heading to the Tailwind docs, going to border width. Oh, actually we do have an 8 pixel border too, so that's pretty handy. So why don't we try this 8 pixel border and see if that gets us close. So if we use an 8 pixel border, yeah, it's not quite as fat as what Steve had. I think he has it set to 10, but 8 is pretty close. So again, if we wanted to customize this, say we did want to have a 10 pixel border, we could do that in our Tailwind config by going to the border width key, because we're trying to edit the border width module. And sort of the convention that we're using in Tailwind 1.0 is these keys are always going to match like the documentation page, but camel case. So if you're looking for how to do border width in Tailwind, you'd go to the border width documentation page. If you want to customize it, the key is going to be border width. This is a little bit different than Tailwind 0. whatever, where this actually used to be called border widths. It was plural, and the names were a lot less consistent. But now we're sort of standardized on the key sort of matches the plugin name or the module name. So if we wanted to add a 10 value, we could just say 10 is going to be 10 pixels. And then if we head back here, we could do border. Oh wait, that's not what I meant to do. Yeah, that's all right. Actually, border 10. And there it is. Because our circle is a little bit smaller, you can see that the inner circle ends up a little bit smaller with that big border too. So you sort of just have to decide how nitpicky you want to get with that. I think that looks pretty good though. Okay, so one thing you notice, right, is as we click around, we're not actually able to change this because we're not changing these styles based on the checked state of the radio button. So the only way that we're going to be able to make this work is using actual CSS. Now, that's not entirely true. Another approach would be to basically re-implement radio buttons using like a view component or something, where we don't actually use an input, we just use spans, and we add all of the area attributes necessary to make it perfectly accessible and make sure that we implement keyboard navigation and stuff properly. That's one way you could do it if you really didn't want to write custom CSS and just wanted to do it with a custom component. In our case, I think it's simpler to just do it with CSS, and then you don't have to implement all that accessibility behavior from scratch. So using a similar approach as we used yesterday for extracting the form inputs, we can extract this radio button stuff. So it looks like we're going to have at least 3 classes, right? We're going to need something for sort of the wrapper, something for the indicator, and then some styles for the actual label itself. So I'm just going to add some classes underneath our form input classes here. So why don't we call it like a form radio group for like the radio button and the label. And then inside the form radio group, we're going to apply relative, flex, and item center. So we'll just use apply, that kind of cool Tailwind feature that we talked about before, to sort of mix in the stuff that we want. So why don't we start by replacing this with form radio group and replacing this one with form radio group. So we're a little bit closer to using our custom elements here, and you can see everything still looks the same, so that's good. Next, we want to sort of hide this input. So one other thing to actually mention, you'll notice that if we get rid of this opacity, the checkbox or the radio button is there and it is like on top. So that means like when you click, if you try to click on this circle that's in the background, you're partially actually clicking the actual input. Now, this doesn't actually matter. There's no actual practical consequences to this. But if you wanted, maybe there's like some weird browser behavior in different browsers where things don't play nicely here. Because this element is totally invisible, if you don't want people to be able to interact with an invisible element, aside from clicking the label, which of course is going to work, then you might want to do something like pointer events none on the actual radio. And what that means is like when you actually click the radio itself, it's not actually receiving click events. So when I click this, what's actually happening is it's only clicking the label because it's falling through to the background. So I think that's probably a worthwhile thing to add, just to be explicit about the fact that we're actually trying to make this input sort of like disappear and not actually interactive, and we want people interacting with the label instead. So I think these are the classes that we're going to want for the actual input. So instead of adding a class to this input, I think I'm just going to use like a descendant selector. So why don't we do something like form radio group, then any input with a type of checkbox or radio inside of it, we're going to want to apply these styles. So now we can actually just like go delete the classes on here. And yeah, we won't do this last one yet. Actually, you know what? Let's add our classes to this one as we go to, so that it just kind of works. So we don't need this class here, but we will need this indicator. So let's pull that down. And we're going to want to update this to ML4. Okay, so we got our 3 indicators and our 3 labels. Clicking still doesn't work. Okay, so the next step is to style this indicator, right? So I think what we kind of want here is maybe a class like form radio indicator. And I'm going to do this a little bit differently than you might have seen other people do it in the past. We could rely on like before and after pseudo elements to deal with this element and kind of make it sort of magically work. To me, it's simpler to just use a real element with a class on it. And, you know, it's just part of the thing you do on this project. When you want to do a checkbox or a radio button, you got to remember there's an input, there's an indicator, and there's a label. And you got to just slam all 3 on there and it'll just work. I just find working with real elements is a little bit easier to start. We could refactor to a pseudo element eventually. Maybe. Sometimes it makes things more complicated though. So let's just start by kind of taking it simple. Okay, so we have this concept of a form radio indicator. So let's do a form radio indicator. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to extract the classes that are common between both implementations. Or actually, you know what? We'll just start with the unselected one. So what we'll do is we'll apply the unselected styles. Then we can remove those ones. And everything kind of still looks good. And now for this one up here, the only difference is the border width and the border color, right? So we can remove every class except the border width and border color, and we should still see the same behavior, and we do. So how can we get like the actual checked behavior happening? We only want to basically apply these styles when this radio button is checked. So we can do that using sibling selectors in CSS. So say we had like a form radio group. Then inside of that, we had an input type radio. And we had that next to a form radio indicator. Now we want to make sure that we're only targeting the checked radio button here. So if we say checked, then we can override some styles here. So we can say add apply, and did I put that in my clipboard? No, I didn't. So we'll grab that. And now, in theory, as long as we did this right, we should only be styling this form radio indicator whenever the radio button that's next to it is checked. That's what this selector lets you do. It basically lets you say only style this, you know, when it's next to something that matches the selector on the left. So let's take a look. If we get rid of this, do we still have anything? Okay, so nothing's selected, but when I click one, yeah. So now we have that selected stuff working. And if I was to go back here and check one of these by default, like maybe we say checked on the second one, and then refresh. Okay, so now we got custom radio buttons working, which is pretty cool. The final thing is the label. So this ML4 thing is going to be pretty consistently the same, I think, whenever you're trying to do one of these custom radio buttons. So I'm going to do like a form radio label here instead of the ML4. So that way, if we ever did want to change the spacing, we could do it all in one place. So we'll do a form radio label, apply ML4. And if we wanted to, we could nest these underneath the form radio group. I'm going to avoid doing that for now because there's no motivation to do it. But if we were ever going to use radio buttons on the site and we want to style them differently, like maybe there's vertical radio buttons or some other weird pattern, then we might want to make these selectors more specific. But since this is the only radio button style that we have right now, I think this is a perfectly valid way to go. So now if we head back here and refresh, what did we get wrong here? Form radio label. Did I mistype something? Looks like we're not getting the margin happening on these. Oh, I mistyped apply. All right. So that should get compiled away by Tailwind now into margin left. And there we go. So that's kind of the custom radio stuff handled. One other little trick, actually, you can see like right now you can select the text here. That can be like sometimes annoying. Like you could be trying to click and you accidentally do a selection. If we wanted to get rid of that, we could just add the select none class to the form radio label, which makes that text not selectable. And it makes clicking it behave like a little bit more reliably. Up to you whether or not you want to do that, but kind of a cool thing to know. Okay, so that's kind of the custom radio buttons handled. We could do the custom checkboxes next, but it's going to be quite similar, like kind of more the same. So we'll see how much time we spend on this, and maybe we'll jump to those later. But why don't we do something different next? So why don't we do these icons inside the inputs and in the button? So if we look at our HTML, you can see we've already extracted some classes for the inputs themselves. So how can we get this these icons to show up? So I'm going to head over to, I got this SVGs file over here where I've already grabbed all these SVGs. So I've got the location one, the calendar one, and the person one. And those are the ones that we need for kind of these elements. So why don't we start by grabbing this location SVG. And we're just going to stick that above the form input. And you know what? Let's just focus on the first one first. So if I save that and head over here, we're going to see like some disastrous thing, right? So as expected, the SVG is outside of the input. How do we get it inside the input? Well, there's no actual way to put the SVG actually within the input itself, right? Because it's just a single tag. It doesn't accept any children. So we have to sort of fake it. So to fake it, we're going to use a trick kind of like what we did up here. I'm going to add a div that encapsulates both the SVG and the input, and we're going to give this a class of relative, so it acts as a positioning anchor so that we can place the SVG next to the input while still having the input fill all the space. I'll show you why this is useful. So if we get rid of that relative, you see that this makes no difference, right? Because the things aren't next to each other. We won't actually need this, but just for a quick reference, if we set it to display flex, actually the SVG is hidden because we haven't given it a size. But let's just give it like a H5W5 for a second, just so you can see it. So now the SVG is next to the input, right? If I make this position relative and I make this SVG position absolute, you'll see what happens is the input fills this entire div. And the SVG just kind of sits on top because the SVG is absolutely positioned, so it's removed from the flow. So this is kind of the base of this whole trick that we're going to use. So we don't need flex in this case because there's only one child anyways, so it doesn't really make a difference. But we are going to want to make this SVG kind of positioned in a specific location. So looking at this mock-up, the icons are sort of centered vertically and sort of inset a little bit from the left. So why don't we get the position and size right, and then we'll worry about the color after. And also you can see like the text for the input is inset more as well. Okay, so with Tailwind, if we want to be able to center this SVG, the trick that I would use to pull that off is, actually, you know what we have to do here? One thing that I should mention, this is actually something I learned yesterday when I was doing some final preparation for this talk. I learned that it's not actually valid to put a div inside of a label. So in this case, we're going to have to make this a span and give it a display block so it behaves like a div, but it's otherwise the same. It won't change anything, but what we had before was actually technically invalid markup, and this is valid markup. Okay, so to get this in the right place, the trick that I like to use in Tailwind is to basically rely on composition. So what I mean by that is something that you might try to do conceptually. You might be thinking in your head, okay, well, I've got this absolutely positioned SVG. I got to figure out like how to center it. So maybe it's going to be like top 4 pixels or something to kind of push it down. Maybe it's like 12 pixels. Okay, maybe it's like 14 pixels. And then we want to position it from the left. So maybe it's like left 12 pixels or something as well. You know what I mean? And you could just kind of fine tune it this way. The problem is this isn't really adaptive. It doesn't really scale to the size of the input or anything like that. I've always really hated when I had to implement something this way. So a better approach is to try and rely on some declarative mechanism for centering things in the browser, right? And one way that you can do that is using Flexbox. Now we can't just apply display flex to the SVG itself because then there'd be no child to center. So what I'm going to do is in this case is I'm going to add a span, you know, as kind of dirty as this feels or whatever. I'm going to move the SVG in the span. I'm going to give the span a class of absolute because that's what we want to position absolutely now, not the SVG itself. And this should basically look the same as what we had before. The difference is now we can sort of position the span where we want it and then center the SVG in the span. So the trick that I like to use is instead of trying to take this SVG and like center it here, I like to give it a wrapping container that acts in sort of a more general way. And I'm going to take that wrapping container and I just want to say, make that wrapping container fill this from the top to bottom and be attached to the left. So I want to create a block sort of like this, and then I just want to center the SVG in that block. So the way that I'm going to do that is using Tailwind. We have these utilities that start with pin for pinning absolutely positioned elements to different edges. I just want to double check something here. Oh, this is terrible. I'm watching the stream on my own screen and it's coming through at like 144p, and I just wanted to make sure no one else was experiencing that same thing. Okay, so we can use these pin classes to specify what edge an absolute positioned element should be pinned to. So pin is going to pin it to all edges. Pin T will pin to the top, pin B to the bottom, pin L to the left, etc. So we want to pin this item to the top and bottom because we want to stretch, right? So we can use pin Y. And then if we want to pin it to the left edge, we can use pin L. So now if we open the inspector and we check this out, you should be able to see we've got this absolute positioned element that is the width of the SVG because you know that's what we have inside of it, and it fills kind of the whole space. So if we set this to display flex items center, we're going to get that SVG vertically centered just like we want. The nice thing is, again, the absolute container fills the whole space and we're just positioning things inside of it. Now, if we want to get that inset from the edge a little bit, we could add some margin to the SVG itself. What I think is a little bit nicer is to actually just add some padding to the container. So we could do something like maybe PL4, and that pushes that over a little bit, maybe too much. Let's compare it to the mockup. So maybe we want something like PL2 or PL3. Probably PL3. That looks pretty close in terms of position. I think the size is a little bit too small, so why don't we try an H6, W6? And that looks pretty close, but of course now this text and the input is not in the right place. Now this form input is sort of designed to put equal padding on the left and right of the text, but when we're combining that with this SVG, we're going to need a little bit more space on the left to accommodate it, right? So we can easily do that by just adding extra padding to the element. So we could just say, give this padding left of 12, for example, and that moves that way over. We might not need quite that much. Maybe 10 is good. 10 seems pretty decent to me. And the reason that this works, by the way, is because we're being deliberate about where we placed this form input class in our CSS. So because the form input class is defined sort of after Tailwind's components, but before Tailwind's utilities, the utilities will conveniently override any styles that are set here. You can see we already have some horizontal padding set on the input, but we can override that in the HTML by just adding a utility and kind of layering that on top, and that'll take precedence. Okay, so why don't we get the color right for this SVG? So where is this thing? Looks like Steve is using AEBFCF. That's probably like this one, maybe? AEBFCF? Yeah. Okay, so that's gray 3. So how do we change the color of an SVG with Tailwind? So with an SVG, normally you specify the color using like a fill property. Instead of Tailwind providing you classes for setting every possible fill color, what we do instead is we give you a class that says fill this element using the current text color, which is the equivalent to doing fill current color. And this is like a special CSS property that just inherits the current color. It's kind of a lesser known feature of CSS, but really useful. And then if we want to set the actual fill color now we can use the text utilities because it's just going to inherit the text color. So we can say text gray 3, and now we have that icon kind of styled exactly as we want. Okay, so something to take into consideration is that we're going to need to do all this stuff for all 4 of these fields, right? So we should probably extract a component class for this to avoid this duplication. Now, first thing I'm going to do before that is, you remember this MT1? We had this, so we had a little bit of a space between the input and the label. I don't think this really belongs on the input class itself anymore. I think it probably belongs up on this wrapper. And this is actually interesting because if you remember from the talk yesterday, I specifically mentioned I didn't think it was a good idea to include that in the extracted class. And this is just validating that decision because we're actually moving this to a different element now. It's really about the context it's placed in. That's not really a property of the form input. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly, actually, not quite yet. Okay, let's extract all this to a different set of classes. So I'm not going to change the form input class at all, but what I'm going to do is basically make like a modification to how it works. So let's think, what would we want this class to be called? Maybe this is like a form input group, kind of like the form radio group. So why don't we add a form input group, and that'll just be relative block. So we'll just say apply relative block. And then we also have this, which I'm going to think of this as basically like the form input icon, kind of like the wrapper for that. So why don't we call this form input icon, apply those classes, and we'll change that here, form input icon. Oh, good grief, can Adam type? Form input icon, form input group. And then for the SVG, instead of having to come up with an extra class for this, since there's sort of an expectation that you should always just be putting an SVG element inside of this span, I'm just going to grab these styles and use a descendant selector for that. So we'll say form, I really can't type form today, form input icon SVG. And we'll just apply these styles automatically to any child SVG. So this way you can just slap the SVG in there without having to do anything, and it'll just kind of work. And then for this input, we have this override, right? This PL10. So I'm going to extract that, and I'm basically going to say anytime there's a form input inside a form input group, we need to apply this. Now, depending on if we were going to reuse this form input group for anything in the future, this might not be specific enough. So maybe actually a better approach is to say, whenever there's a form input next to a form input icon, apply PL10. Because you could imagine a situation where you're actually putting the input or the icon on the right or something, and maybe some stuff changes. So I think that's going to be kind of a safe approach. And now if we've done this right, we should see that everything still kind of works in the browser, and we have these kind of shorter class names that we can use to more declaratively kind of do this. So why don't we update the stuff below to kind of work the same way? So I'm just going to start by grabbing, how should we do this? I guess probably honestly the easiest way is to paste in the whole markup and then just replace the input and drop in a different SVG. So we'll just slam this up here, delete that, delete the empty one, move this one up, delete the empty one, and delete this one. Move this one up, delete the empty one, delete the old one, and now we should have, the same icon for all of them, which is not what we want. So let's just grab the other icons. So I think the first two are the same. Then we need to grab this calendar icon for the dates. So where we have depart return here, I'm just going to replace that with the calendar icon, and we should see that update. And then I'm going to grab the person icon for the travelers section. You can see that's kind of what Steve's got, the calendar and then the person. So this last SVG down here, we'll replace that with the person. And there we go. So it's pretty simple markup really, right? It's like an input group, then it's like a span to house the icon, and then just the form input, and it all kind of works. Okay, what's next? Why don't we do the icon for the button? That one's going to be a little bit different than what we did here. Simpler actually, so let's explore it. So I'm going to grab the search icon, and here where we have the button, let's bring this down so that we have a little bit more space. Inside the button, I'm going to add the SVG. I'm going to wrap the text in a span so that we can target it for styling if necessary. So let's see what this gets us. So that's not quite right? If we want this search icon to be next to the text, then we're going to need to give this button a display of flex. So right now it's got no display set to it, which means it's using its default of inline block. Now, inline block is an inline level element. So if we want to get flex behavior without making it a block level element, instead of using flex, we're going to want to use inline flex. So this should basically work the same as what we had before, except the SVG disappears because it automatically shrinks because it has no size associated with it. So let's take a look at Steve's mockup quickly here, see what he's got. This is about 20 high, and there's going to be a little bit of a view box area around it. So I think if we go with H6W6, which is 24, that should get us pretty close. Okay, so we're going to want to inherit the color of the text for this too. So why don't we also give it fill current? And now we should kind of get the same color. That's nice. Right now, everything is butted up to the top. This text and this magnifying glass are at the top of the flex container. So we can center those relative to each other using item center, just like on a regular flex container. And we're going to want a little bit of space in between them. So why don't we do class ML4 or something on the actual text? Maybe that's too much. 3? 2. I think 2 is going to be the right number. Yeah, that's pretty close to what Steve has. Dig it. Okay, yeah, so that one was easy, right? I think probably the most interesting thing to cover next, since the checkbox is really going to be similar to what we did with the radio button, is maybe dealing with the responsive nav bar. So we have a little bit of funkiness happening down here with like this responsive section. That's something that we could look at tweaking too, although it's a fairly simple tweak compared to maybe what we're going to do with the nav. So let's deal with the nav first. So, yeah, the nav gets all messed up. Am I wrong in feeling like I remembered that we added a button for the menu? I guess not. Maybe that was just in my practice run. Didn't have enough time. Okay, so we're not dealing with the responsive menu at all, right? Everything just kind of falls apart up here. So let's figure that out. So I think to start, simplest thing that we're going to want to do is add like a hamburger or a menu button or something eventually once we run out of space. So I'm going to grab the style for the sign in button, and maybe we'll just make a button with like the word menu in it that we can use as a simple sort of hamburger menu alternative for now. Okay, so let's think about how we're going to want this to work. First things first, when everything shrinks, I think what we're going to want to do is hide all of these things and just have a hamburger menu. So that means all of these links have to be in one container somewhere. And right now, some links are in this container and some links are in this container. So we're going to have to re-architect our markup here a little bit so that we can target both of these at the same time. So I think what we're going to have to do is wrap this in its own div, keep this in its own div, and then wrap both of them in a div together so that there's one shared parent for all of them. And then we're going to have to figure out how to simulate the same sort of behavior that we already had. So at its simplest level, we could kind of close off this icon into its own container too. Let's just kind of see where this gets us. Okay, so everything gets kind of messed up, right? So first things first, we're going to want these to be able to sit next to each other instead of stacked. So we're going to have to do class flex and probably items center on here, just basically inheriting the styles that we had on the container they used to be in. And that gets our alignment correct at least, but things are not in the right place. So the problem now is that we're using justify between. And if you take a look at this nav, you can see there's two chunks now. The left half just has the logo and the right half has all the links. So using justify between is not correct here anymore because we actually don't want these links to be slimmed over to the right. So I think a better approach is going to be to get rid of justify between and just let everything flow all the way to the left and then figure out a way to move these items to the right. So if you take a look right now, you can see that inside this nav, we've got two chunks. This is 40 pixels wide. This is like 556 pixels wide. So aligning these items to the right isn't going to do anything because the container is fixed at that size. What we actually want to figure out how to do is get this container to stretch and fill this whole space, and then we can bump those elements all the way to the right. So that's pretty easy to do with Flexbox actually. Let me just check something here. I think we've got something weird going on with our markup or our indentation. Is there a one space indentation here somewhere? Yeah, this should be here. And this should be there. Okay, I think that's good. Okay, so if we want this element to stretch to fill the remaining space, all we have to do is say flex grow. And now it'll grow and fill the remaining space. So you can see the element fills the whole space now. But we still have that trips and sign in link on the left. So we can get those all the way to the right by using justify between, like we did before, except now we're doing justify between inside like a child element. So now the nice thing is we can target all these links at once, even though we're still getting the exact same layout that we had before. We still have sort of like similar responsive problems, so of course we're still going to have to solve that. But we're one step closer to being able to do what we want. So to start, I'm just going to say, okay, maybe at like, I don't know, we'll start with like medium screen sizes. We'll try and make this stuff disappear. So let's just say hidden by default, but on medium screens and above, we'll go to flex. And since none of these properties are relevant when it's hidden, even though we technically don't have to do this, I'm going to prefix them with MD because I kind of think it's a good way to communicate your intention to other developers. Like it's hidden by default, but on medium screens and above, we're applying these styles. Okay, so there's the medium screen size, and then once we get below that, everything kind of goes away, and we could drop in a hamburger or a menu button instead. All right, so that's pretty good. So why don't we add a button for the menu? So I'm going to start by copying this sign-in button. And we have to think about where we want to put this div. So you might think, okay, we're going to put this menu button in like a div at the end since it's new. The problem is then if we want to show this like hamburger menu and have it fly open, it's stuck in between the icon and the menu, and that can make things unnecessarily complicated. So I think a better approach is to actually put the menu button right after the logo and just conditionally hide this div the same way we are down there. So we're going to want this to be a button because it's going to open a menu, not a link. But it should be pretty close in terms of what we're trying to pull off here. Okay, so you can see there's the menu button. I'm live streaming right now. There's the menu button, and we don't want it showing right now. So if we want to hide that on larger screens, we want to basically do the opposite of what we're doing here. So why don't we say on medium screens and above, it should be hidden. Okay, so now it's gone, but once we get small, it shows up. So now we just got to figure out how to position this. So it's slammed all the way over to the left. If we want it on the right, I think the way that I would personally handle this is I would use flex grow again to make this fill the whole space. And then I would just use text align to align the contents to the right since there's only one child. So there we go. So now we have like kind of the menu that shows up. I'm not going to get into like all the JavaScript stuff for this because I don't think it's relevant, and I don't want this to be like a 4-hour kind of follow-up or whatever, but we can sort of work on what the menu could look like and just kind of assume that behind the scenes we're able to toggle it with JavaScript. So say we wanted to be able to show a responsive menu at like this screen size. How can we kind of get this to show up? So we're going to have to do like some quite fancy stuff here. So how about we get rid of hidden, and we just figure out, okay, well, what do we want this to look like when it is showing up? So this is no good, right? This is not what we would want to happen when we click the menu button. So how about we make this fixed position? So that's going to position it relative to the viewport. And now it's kind of taken out of the document flow. And maybe we'll also pin it to every edge of the viewport. Maybe we'll give it a background of something like blue 8 or something, like a dark blue background. Maybe darker, maybe like a BG blue 9, like a really dark blue background. And you can see like there's all these other positioned elements that are kind of peeking through. So we're going to want to give this like a high Z index. So Tailwind has a Z index scale that goes like 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. So we're going to want this to be right on top, I think. So why don't we go with like our highest Z index value? And now you can see this menu is covering the whole screen. You can still scroll the body. So that's something that you'd want to be able to disable with JavaScript. You'd want to add like overflow hidden to the body with JavaScript. That's kind of out of scope of what we're doing here right now, but we'll just get the styling looking better for this. Okay, so once we're showing this, maybe we want to add like some padding everywhere around it, like maybe some P10 or something to the whole thing, so we got some space. And then all these links, I think we're going to want to make them like display block probably at this size so that they are full width and stack on top of each other. We don't want this left margin on any of this stuff, so why don't we make that only happen on medium screens and above so that it's hidden. And then we'll do the same thing down here. So we'll do block by default. That means this inline block is only going to have to be on medium screens. This margin is only going to be on medium screens. Okay, so we're getting closer. We're going to have to bump up the screen size and fix all the mistakes that we're creating for ourselves here now too. But either way, it's pretty neat, even in general, that we're able to do this at all just using classes in the HTML, like all this responsive design. Okay, so say we wanted to, maybe we should center this text because I think like this sign-in button looks really weird, not centered. So why don't we say, by default, we want text center on this whole thing. And we kind of get this big list. And then we probably want to add some space between each one. So maybe we'll do like a margin top of 6. Maybe like 4. And then for these ones too, we'll also do like a margin top of 4. So now I have like this cool little menu. And if we wanted to be able to close the menu, we could add like a close button to the top that was sort of like conditionally shown or not. And that would be pretty straightforward to do with just like an extra element. We could do like a quick version of that. So we had like a div here and it was position absolute. And maybe we pin it to the top and pin it to the right. And inside of that, maybe we'll have a span with like the times character or something. So you actually can't see it because it's dark color. But if we do text white and maybe like text 3XL and like font bold or something, so it actually kind of shows up, there's like an X icon. Probably you would use like an SVG for this, something that actually looks good. But this will kind of work for now. I hate when that scroll bar shows up and won't go away. So why don't we add like some PT8, PR8, something like that on there. A little too much. 4 and 4. Maybe the top only needs like 2 or something. It's probably because there's line height in here. I think if we actually do like display flex, we'll probably get a little bit better control over this. Actually, probably want to do that on this element. Or just make it a block level element. Then we can get rid of this. Okay, it doesn't really seem to change anything, but it is a little bit more correct for what we want to do. What I'm curious about is if I do 0, how close is it to the top? It's still not as close to the top as I would have expected, and that's probably because there's line height on the X. Actually, that's probably our real problem. So we can say letting none. It's still a little bit away, but that's probably just because of the height of the font. Again, using an SVG would be probably better here. You know what? Let's go and grab Heroicon's UI. Steve has some nice icons here. He's got like either a close or like an X. Is it just called an X? What does he call this? Icon X. Yeah, there's a nice little X SVG. That's, I think, pre-optimized too. So why don't we drop that in there instead? And then we can do our, get rid of his built-in width and height. We can say like H8, W8, fill, current, text, white. And that should give us something. Oh, did I mess something up? Must have. What happens if I get rid of that? What have we done? Oh, we changed the browser size. Yeah, so we do have some problems to solve when we get back to there. Okay, so like PT4, PR4. Why don't we make this even bigger, like 12, something like that. Like a nice big X in the corner that you can close if you wanted to be able to do that. And again, you'd have to kind of wire that up with JavaScript and stuff. And we'd probably want to do like bigger vertical padding on here. So maybe it's PX10 and then like PY16 or something. That'll push the menu down so you don't have like a collision between this X and that. You probably want to make this a button too in a perfect world. Maybe we could just do a button, position the button up there. Shouldn't change how anything looks, but now it's like semantically a button. Or you could put the button inside too. Using something like button type button. And then I would probably want to give both of these a class of block to make sure that they don't behave like inline elements, which can be kind of unexpected. So yeah, now you've got like a nice SVG that's clickable there. Okay, so that's kind of neat, but when we jump up to this size, things aren't looking so hot. So we're going to have to undo a bunch of this styling at the higher size. So instead of fixed position, we're going to want to use static position because that's the browser default. So that should get things a little bit closer. We're not going to want a background, right? We're going to want to remove the background. So we could do like MDBG transparent to add a transparent background, but that's actually doesn't exist right now because of the fact that we overrided Tailwind's built-in colors. So if we want to add transparent back to our color palette, we can just do that here. And that should update in a second. Okay. And it looks like we need to remove some other styles too, right? So what else are we doing here that's a little bit funky? We probably want to get rid of the padding. So we're going to want to do MD P0, probably MD text left to get back to our regular stuff. We're going to want to do an MD hidden on this because it should only be visible on small screens. And then we don't want to do a block on these elements on medium screens either. We're going to want to probably go back to inline. So we can do that here. And then we're also going to want to undo this margin top. So we're going to want to say MD0. Okay, so we're getting a little bit closer. So same thing down here, MD, MT0 into MD inline to undo the styles that we set at the smaller screens. So this one is going to be MD inline block, which we actually already have. I'm going to move that over here so you can kind of see, okay, we do a block, MT4, then we undo the block, we add an MT or an ML6. We're also going to undo the MT4 here and set that back to MD0. And probably for good measure, we should undo the pin in the Z index, even though they're actually not affecting anything in this case. So we can say pin auto to or pin none to just like stop pinning edges. And then we can say MD Z auto to go back to just like where it should be in the Z index. And yeah, so now when we go down to the small size, you can see there's our responsive menu when it's enabled, right? Again, that's something you would toggle with JavaScript. So by default, that would just be hidden. And we would just use JavaScript to implement that when you click that, you open that menu. So you would just kind of get this behavior. Yeah, so that's kind of like a quick and dirty sort of responsive menu with Tailwind. Cool. Okay, so I think that's probably all we'll cover. Other little things that you could tweak if you wanted to just like play around. You know, we could change this font size responsively because it's a little too big on mobile screens. There's some awkward stuff that happens here, you know, so there's some ideas you could come up with for that. Maybe you stack the radio buttons on mobile, or maybe you convert it to like a select drop down. Similar at the bottom here, you know, we got a little bit of messed up stuff happening here. You could maybe put these checkboxes 50-50 and then do like a full width button underneath. And that's pretty easy to do with just kind of Tailwind's built-in stuff. But at least this covers sort of the interesting pieces that people were asking about in the chat and stuff. So I think that'll do it. Hopefully this was interesting, and hopefully you picked up a couple tricks. And yeah, cool. I'll see if there's a way for me to share the source code or something just with the people who attended the conference. Or maybe I'll just make it public and I just won't broadcast it too much so that people can get access to this and play around with this project if they want. But yeah, there you go. So there's a part 2. So we did over 2 hours long for this talk in total. But hopefully you learned a thing or two about how Tailwind works, and you feel a little bit more prepared to experiment with it on your own projects to implement any custom designs that any of the designers you work with and your way. All right. Thanks, everyone. See